Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show, coming to you live from London in the wonderful country of the United Kingdom, a city I've had the good pleasure of coming to on a couple of occasions and have never quite seen as much in the way of freedom-loving people in it all at one time anyway, as I have this week. That is because if you've been following along with the show, you'll well know I've been here for the Ark Forum, the first ever forum of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, an organization in part led by Jordan Peterson, by Canadian Conservative MP Leslie Lewis, by folks like Michael Schellenberger and Baroness Stroud, Philippa Stroud, who has been very prominent in the speaking lineup. I felt bad for her yesterday. I can't remember if I mentioned this, but she was interviewing on stage. This is like a British baroness. She's, the elite of the elite, I guess. And she was interviewing Willie Robertson and Corey Robertson from the American show Duck Dynasty. And I was watching this feeling like she had never heard about them until 5 minutes before she was told she had to go on stage and interview them. And it was a great contrast, this, prim, proper baroness sitting down with this very bearded Duck Dynasty star from rural, I think they're Louisiana, if memory serves. And she was like talking about them, like having, tried to really immerse herself in the wonders of rural America to do a bang up job. And I said, where else but the Ark Forum are you going to see a baroness interview the Duck Dynasty guys? So that was a fun little takeaway from the program or yesterday for the Ark Forum. Today, things have wrapped up entirely. The Ark Forum concluded after its third and final day. And about, what time is it right now? It's 9 o'clock. So I think just about 5 minutes from here at the O2 Arena in London, Jordan Peterson is on stage with Douglas Murray doing kind of a public finale. They sold like 20,000 tickets for this thing. It's insane. A public component, a public finale to the ideas that have been discussed at the Ark Forum among the 1,500 invited folks there from 72 countries, of which I was very fortunate to be one. And one thing that was quite interesting here, I spent a bit of time on Monday kind of doing the contrast between the Ark Forum and its logical counterpart in some ways, the World Economic Forum. These are both global summits with leaders from various fields that are coming together to talk about ideas. And the key contrast between the two, I think, is that the ideas here at the Ark Forum are rooted in the value of the individual, the celebration of humanity and Western civilization. The ideas you hear about at the World Economic Forum are nihilistic and cynical and very anti-human and certainly anti-individual. And I think there's, generally speaking, a broader understanding of that here. It was a very optimistic place. Now, politics has not been an optimistic place in the last few years, and I would say for good reason. We've had some of the most incredible incursions on our civil liberties, not just our own bodily autonomy, but our freedom of speech, our freedom of movement. And politics has become a lot more reactive as a result. So I worried that everyone coming together would kind of be more grievance-oriented in their way. And I was quite pleased, and I will say pleasantly surprised to see that was not the case. There was a message of hope. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some skeptics among us. I had a few little snide conversations on the sidelines. Not snide, I should say, but a few more, I'll say, cynical conversations on the sidelines with people. But of all the backgrounds we saw, people from the US, the UK, Canada, Spain, Germany, Austria, Australia, people from media, people from politics, all of this, people had their own approaches, their own backgrounds, their own challenges. There was one common thread that I saw in almost everyone there, which was a rejection of wokeness and a rejection of wokism. That, to me, is so key here. And I think there's actually a fair bit of hope in all of that, that you can bring together so many people from around the world, and everyone says, all right, we may disagree on this policy or that policy. You may be from the British House of Lords, and I may be from Duck Dynasty, but surely we can all agree we don't want wokeness. Now, what is wokeness? Well, you ask some different people, you're going to get different answers. One of the things that I will point out, though, is that there was a rejection of this idea that children should be taught just untenable things about the world, which are simply not true. Like, oh, I don't know, there are 47 genders instead of 2 biological sexes, that parents are not the ones that should be responsible for their children's education, that we should allow grievance and microaggressions to govern speech and discourse rather than just allowing humans to govern themselves and be civil, and if they're offended, to just not want the state's intervention. I mean, these are all very anti-woke values, which shouldn't be left versus right, but have increasingly been so. And I had a number of conversations where I wasn't even intending to set out down this road. And one of them I did, and that was with James Lindsay, who you may know from X, or Twitter, as we used to call it back in the day, by which I mean like 2 weeks ago. James Lindsay, who goes by Conceptual James on Twitter, and actually was speaking to a very large crowd in Alberta a few weeks ago, and I was trying to get him on the show then, and we just weren't able to work it out time-wise. But I sat down with James Lindsay, and I wanted to talk about wokeness in that proper context here, where it comes from, and more importantly, what on earth we do about it. Not sure if you can distill this big question down into a simple soundbite answer, but I'll give you an opportunity to do so. Where does wokeness come from?
Hell, no, it's the evolution of Marxist thought into the Western context. The Western context is not suited to an economic Marxism because the Western world, with its access to liberty and markets, has enabled upward mobility economically. So it's very hard to say that the worker is intrinsically oppressed and motivate a workers' party when the worker can look at his buddy who said, well, they'll just work harder and you can move up and you can start your own company if you want and everything. And so they had to modify it in thought. You see this in the 60s. They say that we have to move from the working class as our base for revolution and into identity politics. We have to look for a new basis for this energy because the West wasn't suitable to it. So that's where it comes from.
The oppressor-oppressed dynamic makes for some very weird and inconsistent positions. I mean, you were just in Canada recently. You know that Muslim families were leading the charge on the parental rights battles, kind of getting gender ideology out of schools. You fast forward a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden now Muslims are the oppressor or the oppressed group instead of the oppressor. If you talk to some of the people on the left, and the people on the left don't seem interested in trying to reconcile these inconsistencies.
Yeah, that's because this oppressor-oppressed thing is a useful kind of naming heuristic, but what really it is the people and groups and situations that are advancing leftism are good, and the situations and circumstances and groups that are hindering leftism are bad. This is explicit, and I think this is a Maoist project. Woke is a Maoist project. Come to the West. Mao actually says, and he gave a lecture in 1957, or a public speech, on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. And he says immediately, well, who are the people and who are the enemies of the people? Let's distinguish. And he says very clearly, the people who are advancing the cause of building socialism are the people. The people who are hindering the cause of building socialism are the enemies of the people. So it's very clear. That which they can use to advance leftist agendas, oppressed. That which they can't use or that's stopping them from advancing, oppressor, bad, destroy.
People on the right oftentimes want to deal with this by going after the institutions that tend to give the wokists their support. Is that the right approach? Where do you think the way in is to start pushing back against this?
I mean, they've infiltrated so thoroughly that it's very difficult. We do need to start working our way back toward reclaiming which institutions we can. That's going to happen through personnel. In other words, firing woke people when they abuse their positions in power, which they are wont to do eventually, and replacing them with people who are not woke, and having policies arranged to push in that direction or push back in that direction, and simultaneously through changing what I refer to kind of broadly as the liability field. What I just talked about, it's a liability to get hired, it's a liability to keep your job, to be woke, blah, blah, blah. That's part of the liability field, but usually I'm talking about lawsuits where there are discrete harms that are so egregious. In a place like Canada, it's got to be so egregious that the courts can't ignore it. The U.S. is a little more friendly to that. I also think, by the way, that the U.S. and Canada, just to remark, should keep bouncing the energy against woke ping pong ball across the 48th parallel, because we're doing a great job motivating each other. I think we're actually a wonderful pair for once.
There is an anti-woke left. I'd say it's probably not as large as it should be, and a lot of the people in it tend to get typecast as being, evil right-wing racists, Nazis, and whatever. But is there a concern that that coalition among the anti-woke will be too thin to survive if you drill down and, people who are in the trenches saying, yeah, we don't like wokeness, don't really agree on anything else?
The thing is that the anti-woke left is beholden to the power center of the left by virtue of the fact that they still commit to the left. And the power center of the left currently is woke. So they are caught between a rock and a hard place, and sort of almost a black hole. It either sucks them in or flings them completely out into, like you said, right-wing nut job land, even though they're kind of determined leftists. And it's a very big challenge that this group has to deal with, that they would also benefit from woke losing its influence over the left in a, whether sane is the right word or not, but a non-woke left emerging back into the ecosystem of left-wing thought that's permissible would be, beneficial for them. I think that under present circumstances, unless woke has actually dealt itself a fatal self-inflicted wound with this supporting Palestine-Hamas thing, I think that that's going to be a very challenging thing for the left to do. The woke are going to have to be discredited on other terms.
Do you think gender is the issue that's going to destroy that leftist coalition? Because it seems to be the one that has the most broad support for the anti-woke position. The idea that there are two sexes. If you talk to ordinary people on the street, that's a relatively universal thing, but you wouldn't see that reflected in the institutions.
Well, until 3 weeks ago, I would have said most definitely, because I hadn't quite considered how powerfully the anti-Semitism would manifest itself. And that seems to be waking people up much faster, and in particular waking up people with money who are very concerned about what they're funding. I think there's a little bit of irony. We've had such a robust education in the West about Nazis and how bad Nazis are and everything, which is good for that, so that we're very sensitive to recognizing those trends, and we're very sensitive to wanting to shy away from them immediately. But on the other hand, we've learned virtually nothing about communism. So now we find ourselves in the position where the left is championing something that's calling, at times explicitly, for gassing Jews, and all of a sudden this is a shock moment that's breaking people open. As for gender, though, it's the most obviously most untrue position. It's the one that touches the most lives. Being a parent is not a political position. Unlike what the feminists want to say, that the personal is political, parenting is not a political act. And most parents don't think of it as a political act. They think of it as a get through the day and make these kids have enough to eat and the best, environment that they can on a day-by-day basis with just the challenges of parenting. And so what it threatens to allow, and what it is allowing, like we saw in Canada with Muslims and Sikhs and Christians and agnostics and Jews all coming together up until this recent conflict, what we saw was that parenting transcends all the other boundaries, political, religious, and it gives the ability to build a gigantic coalition, plus to start shaking people loose from the cult and thinking something's badly wrong here. We're doing, to be as generous as possible, highly aggressive surgical interventions on mentally unwell children as the pathway to treatment, as the primary pathway to treatment, and threatening to take parents' parental rights away from them through the state if they don't go along with this. This is a scary moment for parents, and scary moments wake people up.
Yeah, I particularly enjoy him saying there that parenting is not political. And I think this is something that when we talk about politics and what engages people, what activates people, I think it's when the state ends up at your doorstep when you never asked for it, that the government has to worry. And that was, I think, the story during COVID, where people who didn't really care about politics or didn't feel the need to get involved in politics felt very personally affronted by politics when government was regulating their liberty in a way that had never been done before in their lives. And parents' rights issues, very same dynamic. People that just want to raise their kids, feed their kids, get their kids a good education, are now finding the state pushing this indoctrination, quite frankly, what else do you call it, on their children. And thus they're like, all right, we're going to take a stand here. And I think that it is interesting to talk about where the greatest victory is likely to come, or the first big victory to chip away at wokeness. And I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that gender is the one. Although, as he said, the anti-Semitism aspect is incredibly key. And, we've been talking on the show since October 7th, since the day Hamas launched this latest round of attacks on Israel, about this idea. And it wasn't just the attacks by Hamas on Israel and on Jewish people, but I think it's the continued attacks and assaults on Jewish people and their rights, their identities, their existence that has become so normalized in communities across the country. On the weekend, 100,000 people took to the streets of the city I'm in right now. 100,000 to get people. I mean, we thought the Freedom Convoy was great because of how many people it brought out, but 100,000 people on the streets, many of whom were very explicitly supportive of violence against Jews and violence against Israelis. I'm not going to say every one of the 100,000 was, but enough were that it should give a lot of cause for concern. So you can make an argument that is a logical argument, even if you disagree with it, that people who are of Muslim background, Arab background, would have a reason to align with the Palestinian cause. Why do people on the left outside of that? Why do people on the so-called queer left, who would have no home in Gaza that would be particularly comfortable with them, do that as well? I wanted to talk about that and this idea of coalitions, which are really at the core of why wokeness has been so powerful. And I did so with Andy No, who is a fantastic contributor. He's a great exposer of the far left and has risked his own safety on a number of occasions to do what he does. And it was interesting to get his take on that very dynamic.
We've seen, obviously, pro-Hamas or pro-Gaza protesters who are Muslim, in which I think we can understand a little bit about where they're coming at it. But we've also seen supporting Gaza and Hamas people on the far left that are in these very weird coalitions, people that wouldn't really get along very well in Gaza. And I'm wondering, with your experience covering far left protests, how these people rationalize support for a society that doesn't really have a place for them in it.
I think the narrative that the public has been sold on the very complicated conflict involving Israel and various Palestinian militant factions is that it's about oppressor versus oppressed, which is this cliche that you hear brought out a lot, but really that's simply sort of the way it's framed. So to a leftist mindset, they want to be on the cause of the oppressed. But there's also been it's not quite as simple as that. We've had years now of radical leftist ideologues, many of them academics, pulling in the Palestinian-Israel conflict, weaving it into the decolonization theory and ideology, I would say. And that we're also now more than 3 years after George Floyd. In America, you have a generation of young people who were radicalized, and now they've been mobilized again to sort of be the foot soldiers. The ideologies are the thread that runs through BLM, Antifa, decolonization, critical race theory, Israel hatred. It's a thread of bloodlust. The ideologies for these different things are quite different. I mean, you have to wonder what does Palestinian nationalism and radical Islamic politics have to do with Antifa or BLM? Well, really very little, other than the fact that they would like to see America suffer and its friends and allies internationally suffer as well.
Do these people understand or have an ability to rationalize this internal cognitive dissonance if pressed, or is it that they genuinely are never pressed and they do not give it any intellectual weight whatsoever about how they can support these two things that are contradictory or that have nothing to do with each other?
They're not pressed in their circles, for one. So I think they generally don't have to really think about it. Or they've been radicalized to become the faithful and the devout, that it doesn't matter actually what countering evidence you present to them, they're able to reject it.
What is, I guess, the logical outcome of this? I mean, a few weeks ago we had in Canada a lot of Muslims and evangelicals linking arms, supporting parental rights, speaking up against transgender ideology. Now, two groups that are on this different side on Israel-Palestine. I mean, are we just going to see more and more of those fractures, or do you think the left will just keep getting larger and larger as that sort of amorphous protest blob that I know you've seen?
Well, what's been happening with the left is that their alliances and their coalitions have been growing. It hasn't gotten smaller. They've added to the long list of people who have grievances. It's only grown. I mean, first it was about black grievance, then it's about brown grievance, then queer and gay grievance, trans grievance. It just keeps growing. And the danger of all this is that present within that type of worldview, there's a lot of support for the use of extreme violence and terrorism. And I think what surprised me a bit about some of the rhetoric that's come out in the last 3 weeks since the 7th of October is that how open they are about their incitement to violence. Before, during the George Floyd-inspired BLM Antifa riots, it was a bit more subtle. It wasn't, and when I say a bit more subtle, it wasn't subtle then, but there was a bit of enough plausible deniability, sort of like when people were smashing up businesses and setting fire to police stations. They were saying they were doing it for racial justice or out of rage because of what's been happening to blacks in America, that it justifies this type of reaction. Now it's like the sentiment is people expressing the support for the actions of Hamas. Like that is, they've crossed the line, and some of them have been called out for it, but a lot of them have been called out, and their response is, yeah, and so what?
Yeah, and I think that is the real takeaway of all of this. These people are not called on it. They don't feel the need to explain themselves because they know they have, to go back to my discussion with James Lindsay, this institutional backing. And they have a media that's generally in their corner. They have, in many cases, a political establishment that's in their corner. And that is, I think, the real reason that you need to, I don't want to say upend institutions, but certainly reclaim them and take them back. And I think the one thing that the left has always done very well is fight on multiple fronts. They fight on multiple fronts, and they also don't take a beat after one win. They move immediately into the next one. And that is so incredibly important. Apparently in the comments section, there, some of you were like not even paying attention to the interview and were just like looking at who you could recognize in the background. So maybe we'll have to do like a Where's Waldo thing. Sean tells me there's a woman named Angela Williams who's been like, identifying everyone in the background. So they all get like credit as being extras on the Andrew Lawton show, which I believe is actually worth nothing. So maybe we don't give them credit for it. But nevertheless, it was actually a lot of fun. And I sort of joked about Davos, that in some ways it's like just a normal convention because you're just, seeing people milling about, but it happens to be, the Prime Minister of Belgium. This was a weird one like that because it was like all these kind of conservative or conservative adjacent celebrity types where you look at them and you'd be like, that's Dr. Oz. Oh, yeah. And actually, I was chatting with Dr. Oz today. We didn't do an interview because I don't really know if I can share this story, but I guess I will now. I was like asking him, I wanted to do an interview, and I said, hey, I just want to run this topic by you. I would love to talk about trust in the medical community post-COVID. And his response was just laughing at me. Not laughing at me, but I think like laughing at the idea, as if to say he realizes that that is pretty much impossible because of how little trust there is. And I would say deservedly so. But nevertheless, Dr. Oz and I had a nice little chat, was chatting with Peter Boghossian, who you may recall, I was actually on his show. He did a little gag, which, well, not really a gag. It's like a thought experiment that I hope to share some footage of when it is published, whenever that is. But I'm trying to think of what else was going on today, because some people are just curious about the feeling in the atmosphere. And I go back to the fact that it was hopeful, which is incredibly, incredibly important. And I think probably unexpected, because we really didn't get the sense that there was much to be hopeful about. Now, we did speak about Israel and Hamas with Andy No. And why this is a bit important, I will point out here that the dog whistles we've heard from people on the pro-Hamas side or the anti-Israel side have become, in some cases, a lot less oblique, a lot less subtle. People have been very explicit. I mean, when protesters chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they are saying is that they want Israel to be annihilated. They want from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea to be all a Palestinian Muslim land. When people talk about gas the Jews, there isn't really a hidden symbolism there. They're saying they want to gas the Jews. But there are some coded words that you hear. And one that I need to call out is the so-called ceasefire. This has become the rallying call of the left. The NDP in Ontario, labor unions, leftist activists, they say, oh, ceasefire, 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 as though Israel is the problem and Israel needs to lay down its arms here. That is the call we hear from people. Now, the one thing that I will point out here is that ceasefire involves a two-way exchange of ceasing fire. Hamas is still holding more than 200 Israelis captive. They're still holding hostages, and Hamas has broken every ceasefire it's had with Israel. Remember, there was a ceasefire in place until October 6th, and then on October 7th, we know what happened. This is one clip which I need to share with you that has been making the rounds here of a Hamas official on Lebanese television, Ghazi Hamad.
إسرائيل دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا. إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها، لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوة، إنه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها، وحنأدبها مرة ثانية وثالثة، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة، لأنه احنا لدينا إصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا إمكانيات أن نقاتل نعم. ونحارب، لكن كما قلت لك بدنا ندفع ثمن. نعم احنا مستعدين، معلش بدي أقول لك بشكل واضح، احنا اسمنا شعب الشهداء وبنفخر أن نقدم شهداء. احنا لا نريد أن نمس لا بالمدنيين ولا أن نلحق الأذى بهم، لكن أوقات لأنه في تعقيدات في الميدان صارت في منطقة موجودة، وكان هناك في احتفال وكان في سكان وفي منطقة واسعة ليست سهلة على امتداد تقريبا 40 كيلومتر. يجب أن ننتهي.
أن ينتهي وين؟ بقطاع غزة؟
ينتهي إلى لا بتكلم عنه كل الأراضي الفلسطينية.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية يعني زوال طبعا. إسرائيل؟
طبعا. وجود إسرائيل غير منطقي. وجود إسرائيل هو اللي بخلق كل هذه الآلام والعذابات والدموع والدماء. هي إسرائيل مش إحنا ضحية الاحتلال، نقطة وآخر السطر. لذلك ما حدا يلومنا، إحنا شو اللي بنعمله في 7 أكتوبر، في 10 أكتوبر، في مليون أكتوبر، إحنا اللي بنعمله مبرر. It is justified، مبررة.
If you don't speak Arabic and you're listening to the podcast and not watching where you'd be able to see the captions, I'll tell you that he did all the greatest hits. Literally called for Israel's annihilation, said we'll do this again and again, over and over, we'll keep doing it, said that the people of Palestine are the victims here, so everything they do is justified. And of course, just to remind you, the again and again bit. That is not exactly the language of a group with whom you could have a meaningful and reliable ceasefire. Yet I haven't seen that clip circulating among the same left-wing folks that have been so keen to call for a ceasefire in the first place. And this is why a lot of them fundamentally are not interested in peace, although they claim that. They are interested in peace on Hamas terms, peace on Palestinian terms. And well, it doesn't fit into the broader discussion of wokeness that I was having on the show. I did want to take a bit of a stop and just talk about Israel, because I ran into Dennis Prager, who's been one of the most consistent and clear voices on Israel. Now, he's a Jewish man, a conservative lion in American media. But his stand for Israel is not just because of his own Judaism. I spoke about that for a few minutes with him the other day.
Let me just first ask you, how would you rank the world's support of Israel right now, left and right? I mean, in one sense, we see, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives saying the right things, but is it authentic in your view?
I'm not a pursuer of the question, is it authentic? I care how people act and speak. How authentic it is, let God judge. I only care about what people do and what people say publicly. So if we live in a world where people feel that they have to come out and support Israel, but they really don't believe it, that's fine with me. It's hard to imagine such a world. Does everybody who supports Hamas, which is the same as saying I support the Palestinians right now, are they mean it, or are they just reflexively anti-West? It doesn't matter. It matters what you do. So, as I said, I don't know about the authenticity issue. I only care about the moral clarity issue. If you can't say Hamas is evil and Israel is good relative to their enemy, your moral compass is broken.
Why is it that so many on the left have such difficulty with that? I mean, you look at, queers against Israeli apartheid being one of the most absurd examples of this. People that would not be able to be who they are in Gaza, but are still believing that Israel is the oppressor. I mean, how on earth do they reconcile that in your view?
How do they reconcile saying men give birth? How do they reconcile saying America is systemically racist? How do they reconcile saying defund the police? The left is always wrong. That is a rule of life. It has been true since Vladimir Lenin till today. Not liberals. Liberals are wrong for voting for the left, but liberal values are the antithesis of left-wing values. The left is always wrong, and everything it touches, it destroys. So when you ask, how does a gay become pro-Palestinian when they might not live a week if they were openly gay in Gaza, whereas they'll have a parade for them in Tel Aviv? It is not a matter of reconciling. They hate what is good. All leftists hate what is good. They hate what is beautiful. They hate Shakespeare. I mean, they hate. These are lost souls. Every civilization seems to produce some, and they have unfortunately become dominant.
Why is, just in closing, Israel so important, and why should it be supported?
Well, there are many separate issues here. Why should Taiwan be supported? Okay, Taiwan is not the cradle of Western civilization that Israel is. It all comes from the Hebrew Bible, everything in the West. But I would be as adamant about supporting Taiwan, to be perfectly honest. The idea that you don't support any other country until you're invaded is not a moral position, in my opinion. You're the strongest country on earth, and you only protect yourself. You don't protect the little guy. But Israel is of incredible strategic importance to America. It is America's ally in the Middle East, a pretty important part of the world. Plus, if you believe in values, that's the cradle of Judeo-Christian values. There's your Judeo. I think that's pretty significant.
That was American broadcaster, author, and PragerU founder, as the name might suggest, Dennis Prager. He's actually fantastic. I interviewed him a few years back when he was doing a big speech in Canada. Very, very gracious. He acted as though he remembered me, but I think he was just being very polite. So he's a good schmoozer. But that was, I think, an important topic. And it was interesting, the whole point of this forum, and I'm going to have some more interviews next week that I won't have time to get all today, just to kind of sprinkle it out. But one of the things that was interesting is that it was about ideas more than it was about individual politics and individual policies. And I had a lovely email from someone, if I can find it, I want to share from a listener who said, just want to drop you a note to say that your ideas from the UK have been, in my view, some of your best work, or your recent broadcasts from the UK. The guests have been compelling, the subjects varied, and your questions have been very astute and germane. Oh, well, thank you. You flatter me. You have tended to concentrate on universal issues, philosophies, and ideals, which makes for deeper conversations. And there's more to the email. I'm going to respond to the person directly after the show, but I quite enjoyed that, because every now and then we get so focused on the nitty gritty, we lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think politics is so often important, but often meaningless as well. And how do I square these two seemingly? I'm being like the leftists I talk about, saying things that are seemingly incompatible. And what I mean is that politics matters. And I think politics is one of the most direct ways in which all of us can make a difference. We go to the ballot box, we cast a ballot, and we, along with tens of thousands of other people, elect a member of parliament who, along with 337 other people, can vote on policy. So your fractional share of influence is very, very small. It's very, very small. I mean, statistically speaking, most people, if they as individuals stayed home, it would make no difference in what happens in the course of the country. But it's all of us together doing that makes change. But at the same time, it's not the only thing we can do. And I think people that focus only on politics are not really in the business of making change. There was a time in which I stood for political office, and I thought that was a way I could perhaps make some change. I know now that, perhaps being in the Ontario legislature from 2018 to 2022 would not have been a period in which I probably would have been, with my libertarian bona fides, particularly welcome. I maybe could have pushed back in some ways verbally, but I wouldn't have been able to stop these things that I found so horrible. I like to think that on my show, I was able to wield a bit more influence by talking about this, by telling the stories of real people. And this is where we choose our battlefield. Do we want to battle on the floor of the House of Commons or the legislature of our province? Do we want to battle in the marketplace of ideas? Do we want to battle in the classroom? Do we want to battle in civil society in some other way? And I do think that oftentimes, this policy, we're going to do tax credits for parents to enroll their kids in sports programs. Well, that's a policy that means something to people. It's a policy that may save people a couple $100s a year. Even the carbon tax, it's a policy that means something to people. But does any of that matter if the core foundations of our civilization are being eroded every single day? And that's where I think you need to do both. And I think sometimes you need to get down to the nitty gritty, and sometimes you need to talk about the big ideas. So I really enjoyed being able to do that this week. And I don't know if I want to say I'm going to make this the big ideas forum on my show, but I would like to, if I take that email from that gentleman to heart, find ways to incorporate at least every now and then some of these bigger ideas that separate us from the day-to-day of politics. So that's a bit of I don't know if it's a pledge there, but I guess a bit of a thought there. Just before we wrap things up, we were going to be talking about the Alberta election, or I guess more the UCP AGM. The election's already come and gone. This is quite a fascinating story. The United Conservative Party of Alberta is having its AGM this weekend. I'm going to be there, so I'm actually taking a bit of a detour on my way back. Tomorrow, I'm flying to Calgary for the UCP AGM. And this is going to be fascinating because we have a few resolutions that are up for debate that are dealing with some of the issues we've talked about on this show, notably parental consent and gender stuff. But you have also pushing 4,000 people. 4,000 people that are registered and will be attending this. Now, that's largely due to the organizing work of Take Back Alberta. We were supposed to have David Parker, who is the founder of that, but he has not dialed in for the interview, and I don't think at this point we're going to be able to get him in time if he does. So it's unfortunate. I was looking forward to speaking to David about this, but the folks in Alberta are going to have, it looks like, the largest political party convention Alberta has ever seen. Now, why are people so involved? Is it just because there was an organizing effort to get people in? Is it because they feel they can wield some real influence in the UCP and by extension the Danielle Smith government? I don't know. But that's going to be one of the things to talk about here. What has activated thousands of people in Alberta to want to go to a political party convention where they have to spend money, book a hotel, when they could be doing anything else? And this is where I go back to, what it is that motivates people. I mean, herding libertarians has got to be the most thankless task imaginable. And the people in Alberta have had that happen. There was a mobilization effort to vote out Jason Kenney, which was ultimately successful, a mobilization effort to elect Danielle Smith. And now, even though she's there, there's an effort underway to make sure that party maintains its grassroots mandate and doesn't become exactly what a lot of these critics thought and claimed the Jason Kenney government had become, certainly by the end of it. So that's going to be something we are keeping an eye out for. Tomorrow, we'll have something very special for you. I'll give you more of an update on that. It's going to be pre-recorded because I'll literally be in the air during the showtime. And my last few attempts at using Air Canada Wi-Fi have not given me confidence that I could, live stream a show from wherever I am on the plane. So we will find a way to bring you that, but it's going to be lots of fun. And then I'll have a full report on the UCP AGM over the weekend and a bit of a recap on Monday's show. So lots of good stuff, as Justin Trudeau's team would have said back in the day, sunny ways ahead, except this time, I mean it, and it's not sunny ways on Justin Trudeau's terms. So with that, I will bid you farewell. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.